The PRovoke Podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Hello everyone and welcome to the PRovoke Media Podcast. I'm Maja Pawinska Sims, the EMEA editor of PRovoke, and I'm joined today by two guests who are going to talk to us about an aspect of climate change, specifically how the standards around disclosure of climate lobbying are evolving. As the urgency of the climate crisis intensifies, more and more corporates are beginning to disclose more information about their climate policies and actions, and the extent to which their work with third parties like trade associations aligns with those policies and with the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement. So here with me today to explain what's going on and the implications for the communications industry are, first of all, Chris Pratt, Managing Director of Hill+Knowlton's Better Impact team in the UK, which is a specialist sustainability and social impact consultancy. Chris is hugely experienced in building multi-stakeholder forums to address sustainability issues, ranging from climate change to plastic waste, and he's passionate about driving change in organisations through measuring the impact and transparent reporting. He's also a member of the PRCA's Climate Communications Group. And second, we have Matthew Phillips, Comms Director for the UN's High-Level Climate Champions for COP27 and COP28. For the last 10 years, Matthew has led strategic communications and campaigns to advance the climate action agenda. His work to support international climate negotiations has included positions at UN Climate Change, Mission 2020, and he was an advisor in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. Matthew also managed the reporting and tracking team at UN Climate Change and is the co-founder of a sustainability engagement agency, Beautiful Corporations, which he established in 2013. Chris and Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Maya. Glad to be with you.
Hello, good to be here.
Great to have you both. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to start from the off by saying I'm very much the idiot in the room here, and you two are the experts. So I'm going to ask the stupid questions, and you're going to inform everybody with some great, insightful, and useful answers, I'm sure. Matthew, this is such a complex area. Could you set the scene and give us some context? What's been going on around climate lobbying disclosure standards? How's the situation evolving, and why are we talking about this now?
Thank you, Maya. It's really good to be here. And maybe what I'll do is I'll actually just start with the science, as we all must do. We've just had published the sixth and final kind of segment of the IPCC's report on how we're managing impacts of climate change. It very much is the final warning on the kind of the target for 1.5 degrees. And what we can see through that report is not only are the impacts of climate change getting all the more devastating, but the window for addressing them and for acting accordingly is narrowing all the time. And I think what we need alongside that massive delivery and implementation gap is actually to close the advocacy gap. So now more than ever, we really need corporations to step up and really call for what they need from not just national governments, but also kind of city and regional magistrates too. We know that corporates, 93% of them also acknowledge that climate change represents the biggest risk to their enterprises. But equally, the same proportion of companies, if we take that as a kind of subset, only 50% of those are lobbying for what is in alignment with the Paris Agreement to act on climate change. So we know that basically corporate lobbying remains completely lackluster in comparison to those that are acknowledging the scope of the problem. I realize this is a very difficult problem and challenge. And I think that, there's an enormous opportunity this year. We're currently in what's described as the stock take of climate action, which is part of the UN climate change process, where governments, but also non-state actors, are required to take a kind of a look in a mirror, assess where we're at in terms of trying to get us to a kind of 1.5 degree pathway, and then start to signal the steps by which we need to kind of get there or course correct in terms of to meet those those kind of big climate targets. And I think what we're hoping is that corporates, as a part of this stock-taking process, are going to step out, raise their heads above the parapet, and start calling for the types of policies and regulation that they need in order to go at the necessary kind of rate. Because as we know, we're all very much behind. So hopefully, that provides a little bit of a kind of scene setter in terms of the urgency to act, but also to kind of shout out for what's required.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. Now, I know that hot off the press, you've just published a UN report out of COP27 in Egypt. How has that moved the conversation forward?
So, well, the latest report is what's landed today. I think that what we've seen is that the impacts are ever more glaring. As I mentioned, the implementation gap is becoming an increasing cause for concern. I think what we're quite keen to introduce, I work for a team called the UN Climate Change High-Level Climate Champions, as you mentioned, is to basically work out a system for corporations about what they need to do in order to be in alignment with the science, Maja, that you've just mentioned. So we brought into being a campaign. It's called the Race to Zero. The idea is that all corporations rally behind high quality net zero criteria to make sure that there is sort of an even level playing field amongst all of them. So we have 4 parts of that criteria to hopefully respond to the science in the most urgent way possible. It's basically around 4 Ps: pledge, plan, proceed, and progress. So the first thing that all corporations are required to do as part of this campaign is pledge that they will get to net zero emissions by mid-century, that's 2050, and actually to have a checkpoint on the way to get there, which is to halve emissions or a fair share of emissions by 2030. We then have the second part of the criteria, which is plan. They need to basically make sure they've got a credible transition plan in place that basically goes from the actual commitment that they've pledged into actually what they're going to do at a granular level in terms of getting there. The third part is proceed, which basically means they need to be showing and demonstrating that they are taking action right now, so that the horizon isn't something that we're shooting for or trying to reach for, but we're actually demonstrating how corporations in this case are already moving towards reaching their targets. And the final part of the criteria is progress, which is basically that all corporations must transparently report back on progress, so that, as I mentioned, during this stock taking year, we can basically see exactly where different actor types are on their journey towards achieving the Paris Agreement. But all that said, and kind of relating back to my point around advocacy, this year we've started to really step into a 5th part of the criteria. We've called this persuade. It was originally called policy. We were sticking to our P theme there. And now what we really want all corporations to understand, I'm keen to kind of go into more detail on this at a later point in this conversation, but is for all kind of corporations to understand how they align their policing and lobbying practices with the Paris Agreement, with what the science is telling us. And perhaps I'll talk more on that in a moment, Maja.
Yeah, that would be great. Obviously, persuasion is the business that we're all in. Chris, have you got anything to add on the context and why we're talking about this now in a communications context?
Thanks, Maja. And yeah, Matthew's very neatly laid out what the UN Climate Champions Group are doing in this space and calling for. But I think it's also important to point out that there are a number of other groups who are pulling in a similar direction and really calling for corporates to have much better alignment between their climate policies and what they are asking representatives, agents, trade associations to do on their behalf. And other groups, for example, include Climate Action 100+, which is related to the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. So effectively a group of investors who are and have been for several years calling on large emitters to provide greater levels of disclosure and clarity about both their policies and how their policies are aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement, but also to talk openly about how they are advocating, how they are engaging with governments, and talk about their relationships with third parties like trade associations. Because for a long time, actually, I think there has been some some separation perhaps between what, say, a trade association is lobbying for in a forum like the European Union on behalf of a company, and what that company is saying publicly itself about its support for climate change. So these initiatives are really just seeking to overcome that discord and to make sure that there is better alignment. And it's from experience, it's not often the case that this is necessarily deliberately done. It's often the case that there just have not necessarily been the controls and reporting mechanisms in place. And so what groups like Matthew's and the Climate Action 100+ group are doing is to set frameworks that enable a consistent disclosure of the risks and the misalignment that exists within an organization and its peers. Another group is and I think you alluded to it earlier, Maja, the UN high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities, to give it its full name, was a group that was led, a high-level UN group led and produced a report at COP27. They had a number of recommendations, and actually one of their recommendations, recommendation 6, called on companies to begin to better align their lobbying and advocacy on climate policy with their net zero plans. So there's a number of groups all pulling in the same or similar direction in order to ask companies to make better disclosures and to ensure the better alignment between their own stated policies on climate and those of third parties.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I can see that where comms comes in at the intersection of all that stuff around consistency of messaging, advocacy and alignment. But it sounds like there's lots of different things going on in terms of a framework. Is there actually just one global standard? How do companies and their corporate comms council decide which standard to follow?
Yes, there is actually a global gold standard, which has been published and is supported by some of the groups that I've already mentioned, particularly the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. So that global standard on climate lobbying is available. It remains a voluntary standard, but it sort of sets out the emerging expectations for corporates and their representatives with regards to openness and transparency around climate policy and lobbying. So that really is as it says the global standard, and corporates and their representatives can sign up to and pledge to commit to the voluntary requirements set out in that standard. But it's also worth saying there's a lot of alignment between the different groups as well. So if, as an organisation, you have signed up to the Race to Zero campaign that Matthew's mentioned already, actually many of the requirements set out in that campaign are quite well aligned with the global standard on climate lobbying. Similarly, although this really only applies to listed entities, because of course this is the focus of investor action, the Climate Action 100+ group and their partner Influence Map set out a framework for disclosure and framework of requirements, and you again will see quite a lot of alignment in terms of that framework with the global standard on climate lobbying. So it's all they're all slightly different, but they're all fairly consistent as well in the main in terms of what they require of companies in terms of their reporting.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So tell me, how does this all of this impact on the communications profession? Is this just for public affairs specialists or sustainability communication specialists, or does more of our community need to know what's going on here?
I think it would be great if organizations from a communication standpoint take this on in a really holistic manner. So it should necessarily involve the public affairs professionals, but also the communications professionals as well. And I think just the core word, just to kind of tap in with what Chris was saying, is around convergence. There is so much going on, but if we can get into a collective space between different types of professional groups around actually what is leadership when it comes to climate advocacy, then we're at a good place. We describe it in kind of 3 primary ways. One is do no harm, which is by really taking time to understand what relationships corporates hold internally and externally, and ensuring that all of those relationships are consistent and aligned with the objectives for halving emissions by 2030 and reaching that net zero target by 2050. And then secondly, we want everyone to think about proactive engagement. So going beyond doing no harm, and then thinking about how one can engage publicly, such as supporting climate policies at the subnational and the international level. And I guess, Maja, that would then include not just the public affairs individuals, but those kind of working in external media relations too. We very recently saw an incredibly powerful effort by over 400 businesses that are part of the We Mean Business Coalition that had a footprint in the US that called on the Biden administration to ensure a 2030 emissions reduction target that was in line with Paris, and ensuring that was incorporated within their kind of national contribution to the Paris Agreement. So that had a massive impact. And I think, as I mentioned before earlier on, we really want to make sure that corporations are also reporting back publicly and disclosing what trade affiliations that they have, and ensuring that there's a governance mechanism in place to provide accountability and alignment across all policy and engagement actions. So that would then actually necessarily include board involvement too. So many different levels of an organization.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, carry on.
No, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. And having produced a number of these reports for clients, just to get very sort of practical for a moment, actually what this does involve is collaboration across the business. And so typically the home for this within an organization might well sit within the public affairs function. It might well sit within a legal and a compliance function. In some companies that I've worked with on this style of reporting, it's also been and sits within the sort of the corporate reporting function. It really depends on the organization. But what I would say is what I've found is it's actually a really useful way to better understand risks within an organization that the organization might not have been aware of. So in some respects, this involves relationships across the globe for a large global organization, relationships that might be held by a lot of different parts of the organization. So, it might be that a trade association in a distant part of the world, the relationship is held by the country leadership within that organization, rather than anyone that sort of sits within a communications role or function. And so actually the risk for the corporate, in terms of there being any sort of incongruence between the central policy, climate policy position and the actions of their business in different parts of the world, is quite acute. And so it's a very good way to have a better understanding of the risk associated with those relationships and positions that exist around the world. But it has to force collaboration. It has to involve lots of different parts and functions of the organization, typically, in order to make sure that the alignment that is reported, or misalignment that is reported, is consistent with the actions of the organization. So you've really got to sort of turn over a lot of stones within the organization and force that collaboration.
Yeah, I can see what the implications might be for reputation management and even crisis management if businesses get that wrong, and the misalignment is acute and noticed externally, shall we say. Is this just for the biggest corporations, though? So it's just relevant for comms professionals working with the world's very biggest companies, or is it relevant for everybody now, Matthew?
I think very much the latter, and we'll see also supply chains getting affected by the biggest corporations. So it's really about how corporations can work, across the kind of sectors that they're and systems that they're within. I think what we're finding is that it's going to be really important for them to sort of get ahead of the regulatory landscape. Chris mentioned the high-level expert group's report that kind of came out at COP27, which sort of is a group led by the Secretary General and setting out kind of leadership practices for corporations around net zero. And he mentioned recommendation 6 around aligning lobbying and advocacy within an organization. But recommendation 10 is around accelerating regulation. And it's basically a recommendation for regulators to ensure that corporations and other actor types within their jurisdictions are in line with net zero. So basically what we're having is this almost tug of war between corporations and non-state actors aligning their lobbying and advocacy with net zero, and then obviously the regulators ensuring at the other end that they are starting to kind of impose regulation standards and policies that require those entities within their jurisdictions to get in line. So this is a real opportunity, actually, now that this expert group's recommendations are the gold standard, for corporations to really step out, get ahead of it, and be leaders within their field and alongside other corporations. So this isn't just a conversation they can have with their employees. And I think there are so many opportunities for them to have meaningful engagements internally, but also with their peer groups, and work out how they can kind of navigate this new landscape accordingly.
Thank you, Matthew. Chris, I want to know from your point of view, working at Hill+Knowlton, having worked with lots and lots of different sorts of organisations, what do you think the comms industry is currently doing right in supporting companies and clients in around climate reporting and lobbying disclosure? What are we on the right track broadly, or is there still quite a lot of work to be done?
I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done, if I'm honest. I think there is, and I've worked with many organizations already who are quite open to this process, and even the organizations like Matthew's and Climate Action 100+ are approaching this through the lens of practicality. You know, if they identify misalignment, if an organization identifies misalignment between their own policies and the policies of a representative like a trade association, then it's far simpler to report that and disclose that in a report, and to set out a consistent way that they will engage with those organizations in order to seek alignment, than it is for that misalignment to go unreported, unrecognized, and for the status quo to continue. And as I said, those groups are very, very practical when they approach this. They're not, for example, looking for organizations to pull the plug and exit their trade association relationships as part of this. They want a program of engagement, because it is through that engagement that real change can happen. But to your point, I think that changes. We're still at a very sort of nascent stage. There are a lot of organizations who have produced reports, but if I look at the list identified by Climate Action 100+, there are still several organizations who have yet to report, and these are global businesses who have the means, have the capability to do this, and are just not yet. And even so, those who have produced reports, some of them are still relatively score relatively poorly when marked by Influence Map and by Climate Action 100+. So I think even that shows that organizations who've sort of taken the plunge and started to disclose still have a way to go in terms of improving the standards of that disclosure and reporting over time. So I think this is only going to increase as a part of the framework of reporting and disclosures that companies are going to have to become more accustomed to, particularly, as Matthew says, this I suspect becomes something that is regulated for by governments and other state level regulators.
So how do we? Sorry, Matthew, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to riff off what Chris was saying, and I agree. We're at the sort of the nascent stages of working out how kind of corporations really kind of best put their advocacy feet forward, so to speak. But we are kind of, I think, evolving in terms of sophistication around this. I know that at the moment there is a responsible policy engagement task force that has been established by many of the entities that Chris has already mentioned. I think it includes We Mean Business, but also the Science-Based Targets Initiative and Influence Map. And this kind of task force is going to be putting out a handbook in June, which hopefully will provide more guidance in terms of how corporations can collectively step forward in the realms of advocacy and describe what that means, not just at a national level, but also in terms of sector by sector. So start kind of breaking it down in terms of what that means in aviation or in land use, etc. So hopefully some of these tools are going to be more forthcoming now that a lot of the direction of travel has been set.
Okay, I mean, I'm just wondering what do communications professionals need to do to kind of really get up to speed on this? Because it's moving quite fast, isn't it? Like you said, there's various kind of frameworks, standards, tools coming down the line. But what actually needs to happen for the comms industry to educate itself and really get up to speed? Because there's so much of this is about communications, isn't it? And effective communications, consistent communications. So what actually needs to happen?
Yeah, it absolutely, Maya. I think, though, it's not that complicated. In positive news, the frameworks are emerging, and they're very clear. Actually, there's not. They use some technical language, and I think it's why my team, who are we're specialists, we do sort of specialize in this sort of work. Why we've perhaps started to do this work before it's become more mainstream. But there's nothing about the frameworks necessarily that are so technically complicated that actually any communicator who goes through those frameworks couldn't actually fully understand them. I think as well, these groups are seeking improvement rather than perfection, and so in tackling this and starting to make these disclosures rather than as soon as possible, rather than waiting for the guidance to be absolutely perfect. You have the opportunity, I think, to really get ahead of things and to avoid any of the potential risks that we've already talked about in terms of reputational harm. So it is a technical discipline, but I don't think it's so technical that you can't simply look at some of the frameworks that we've talked about and begin to understand what that means for your disclosure. There's also several reports that are already out there, many of them linked via the Influence Map website and scored by the Influence Map website, and you can start to see there, what is the difference. And Influence Map as well are very clear about why they have suggested that one report is better than another one, or where the levels of improvement might be achieved. So this is not a sort of hidden landscape. There's plenty of materials out there to better inform yourself and to understand where to get started.
Matthew, did you want to add anything there in terms of what comms professionals need to do? And I'm just wondering specifically whether, this is clearly not a case of comms being bolted on the end of something to communicate externally companies' action. This has got to be part and parcel of business transformation, of being right at the heart of what a company is actually doing and taking action on. Right, so there seems to me there's still a bit of a gap in terms of knowledge and expertise in the communications sector around all of this stuff, however accessible all these frameworks are. What's your view on that?
Yeah, just to break it down really simply, as I said before, I think it's around two things: alignment and then proactive engagement. So firstly, how can you have that internal education to make sure that all employees know that external campaigns, whatever events they get involved in, whatever memberships that they hold, need to be in alignment with these kind of core Paris targets that I've set out already. I think we do see a lot of misalignment and around that in terms of sponsorship of various events, for instance, and certain kind of core company policies being completely not in keeping with nature protection and all the rest of it. So I think that is definitely a key education piece that can go a long way towards that kind of rich understanding and alignment. And then the second thing is working out, as I say, what we can do in terms of the proactive, the calling on our regulators, on our national governments to do what we know is required. There is a lot of kind of resources and information already out there that Chris has mentioned. If kind of folk want to go up and assess what's out there and how they can kind of be best in alignment. I think just maybe to touch on a couple of products that haven't been mentioned, I would definitely take a look at the B Team's Trade Group Misalignment Toolkit. The CLG have also done the kind of Cambridge Leadership Group have done an advocacy toolkit for business and climate leaders, and also the Business for Sustainable Responsibility have done a Transform to Net Zero Climate Policy Engagement Transformation Guide. So these are all kind of toolkits, resources that kind of companies can look at, understand it, and work out what they want to kind of align with and emulate in their own practices.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matthew. And what's next? What's coming down the line in terms of climate and sustainability reporting that we should be aware of?
Well, I can talk very much in terms of the race to zero. So the race to zero's criteria comes out, it came out in June last year, on June the 15th. Members and partners have 1 year to basically show that they are applying and meeting that criteria. So I mentioned at the very top that we introduced this fifth component to our criteria, the persuade policy component. So that was released on June the 15th last year. So what we're requiring is that by this year, June the 15th, all partners will have showed how they're going to be incorporating that fifth P within their frameworks. Our partners are entities like the Under 2 Coalition, SBTI, Business Ambition for 1.5. So these are the coalition partners that represent many thousands of businesses. And then we have basically another year, so that's June 2024, for members to be expected to implement those kind of that kind of policy, those policy guidelines within what they're doing. So they've got another year to do that, but that's what's coming down the road. And as I say, with the Secretary General having released his recommendations, we're likely to see this getting dialed up quite quickly, and corporations really starting to report back on progress, not by June 2024, but perhaps much earlier by COP28 this December in Dubai.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. I'm just going to ask you both as a final kind of takeaway from this. What one action, if you're a communications professional, whether you're working in-house for an organisation or as agency counsel, what one thing could you do tomorrow to really move forward and better understand the implications for the businesses you work for and to educate yourself?
It's quite simple, really. I think the first thing to do is to have a conversation with your colleagues or with your clients about this. Like I think we said earlier on, the number of organizations who are producing these reports is still relatively small. I think the very fact that we're having this conversation, that this work and the outputs of it, the disclosures, are relatively unknown in many organizations, I think should mean that simply by having a conversation with some colleagues, you can hopefully get a better sense of whether this is something that you have begun to think about as an organization, or if you've examined the frameworks and it's part of your disclosure plans either for this year or for next. I think you will only know by asking the questions, and I think it's clear based on certainly our conversations with clients. Many clients still don't necessarily realize that this is something that they need to do, or they don't necessarily realize quite what the implications are of these requests from groups like Matthew's. And so just starting with a conversation to understand that, I think would be, I hope that's not an oversimplification, but I genuinely think these things can go unseen and unknown if those conversations are not happening.
Good advice. Matthew, anything to add to that?
And I think that's the first step, right? That internal conversation, but then it just naturally leads to then the second external conversation that these corporates need to be having with their peer groups, with kind of regulators within their various different jurisdictions, and then also with national governments. So what do those external conversations look like? Because it doesn't have to be a sort of negative, unconstructive finger pointing thing. It can actually be a collaborative exercise and journey that these different entities go on together. So I think it's really interesting to work out what those second conversations look like, and perhaps also how different kind of businesses within different sectors can team up together and work out how they can kind of be part of the same journey.
Okay, it's all about the conversations, isn't it? All moving very fast. There's clearly loads to be done, and loads that the comm sector can get involved in here in terms of supporting and counselling, indeed, clients and the organisations they work for to move forward, all in the right direction. I'll put links to loads of the resources you've mentioned in the blurb for this podcast, so they're accessible immediately to everyone who's listening. But Matthew, Chris, thank you so much for that primer and for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.